Folks, good afternoon. We're going to get started here. Thanks for coming out. We thought we would be ahead of the curve by holding this event today on May 11th, since the deadline for President Trump to announce a waiver or non-waiver of Iran sanctions was May 12th. But President Trump, as is his wont, managed to get out ahead of the news cycle and beat us to it. So rather than talking about what the president might do, we're going to be talking about what the president has done, which is, in a nutshell, to announce the American withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, and the reimposition of sanctions, quite extensive sanctions. I think it's fair to say that the steps the president took were more severe than really any analysts had predicted. I think to the extent there was a debate, the debate was, well, will the president decide to accept some sort of U.S. Agreement with the European powers, or will he decide to not extend the waiver of the sanctions which were due on May 12th, those being the so-called NDAA sanctions? And we'll get into all the details of that in just a moment. Instead, he decided 4 days early to reimpose not just the sanctions that were due on May 12th, but all of the sanctions which had been suspended pursuant to the JCPOA. We're going to get into in this panel what exactly has happened and its implications, and of course the diplomatic road ahead. We'll be starting with Kate Bauer, my colleague here. Is that right? Or no, I'm sorry. We're going to be starting with Patrick Clawson. Patrick is our Morningstar Senior Fellow and our Director for Research. Patrick is also one of the town's deepest experts on Iran, and he'll be talking about what's going on in Iran. He may also mention energy markets, which is something else he's quite well versed in. Then we'll be going to Kate Bauer, my colleague, who's also a veteran of the Treasury Department, and she'll be talking about the reimposed sanctions and what that effort might look like, the challenges it might face, what will be required to make that sanctions pressure work. Kate is not just a veteran of the Treasury Department, but she's also our Blumenstein-Katz family fellow, and we're very glad to have her with us today as well. I'll follow myself by speaking about the diplomatic road ahead, what might be required to implement this policy the Trump administration has talked about, and what gaps really remain to be filled out, and there's quite a few of them. I am Michael Singh. I'm the Managing Director and Lane-Swig Senior Fellow here at the Washington Institute. And between us, we have had some experience in past U.S. efforts to do exactly what the Trump administration looks to be trying to do in the coming weeks, months, and years. And that is to both exert some pressure on Iran and get a diplomatic process going. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Patrick Clawson.
Thanks. So let me just start with a few words about energy markets and then turn to the main subject, which is Iran, and how this decision fits into the Iranian scene. First, this is almost as bad a moment to try and press Iran about oil as the last time we tried to do that. To remind you, the last time that we tried to press Iran back 2011, the price of oil had just gone up by $30 a barrel. And oil markets were very tight. The price of benchmark crude had reached $111 a barrel. And we turned on the pressure, and oil prices stayed that high during almost all the time that we were negotiating the JCPOA, only to crash right after we were done. And now the recent months, oil prices have started going up again, and for much the same reason they did last time, which is to say not geopolitics, but instead the market fundamentals, which is that the world economy has recovered from the last recession, consumption's going up. So the most recent forecast from the Energy Information Administration that came out on Monday said that the demand for oil worldwide this year is going to be about 3.3 million barrels a day higher than it was 2 years ago. And that's quite a robust increase in demand. If that's the first driver of why oil markets are tight, the second driver of why oil markets are tight is because the Saudis decided, and also the Russians, and in fact the two of them in coordination,
that they would limit production in order to drive the price higher. And so the Saudis seem to be quite comfortable with limiting production in order to drive the price higher, although, frankly, they don't have a whole lot of excess capacity. They haven't made the investments the last couple of years in expanding their capacity, and so they've only got OPEC as a whole has only got about 1.8 million barrels a day of excess capacity. It's less than 2% of world demand. But still, the constraint on the part of the Saudis and Russians in not investing the last few years has left us in this position where markets are relatively tight. And in fact, the Saudis are talking about driving the price up to $80 a barrel, and I think that's very much where they would like to see it go. Now, the factor which has limited the price rise in oil to only $10 or so has been the expansion of U.S. production, which has been stunning. You recall I said that worldwide oil demand is up by 3.4 million barrels a day over the last 2 years. U.S. oil production over that same period is up by 3.3 million barrels a day. So essentially the United States has over the last 2 years has expanded oil production by as much as a significant-sized oil-producing country, 3.3 million barrels a day. This year, U.S. oil production is going to be 16.4 million barrels a day, which is one heck of a lot of oil. And the United States is not in a position to particularly expand faster than that, primarily because of physical constraints. The principal problem being that the oil pipeline companies in Texas did not expect demand to increase that quickly, production increase that quickly. And so we lack the physical capacity in those pipelines. This is not a matter of environmental, constraints and Keystone Pipeline and all that. It's just a matter of not having built the pipelines. So in this context, Iranian oil exports of 2.4 million barrels a day are frankly not that big a deal as they once were. That Iranian exports, about 1.5 million barrels a day goes to Asia, about a third to China, about a third to India, and the rest between Korea and Japan. About 600,000 barrels a day goes to the EU, and about 300,000 barrels a day goes to Turkey. Right now, Iran is therefore exporting about 900 million barrels of oil a year at $70 a barrel. Do the math, 900 times 70 is $63 billion. If we're really lucky, we may be able to reduce Iran's oil exports by 500,000 barrels a day. And that would drive Iran's oil exports down to 700 million barrels a year, and the price may go up to $90. Well, 700 million times $90 is 63 billion, which is the same as 900 million times $70. So no, Iran is not going to be in a world of hurt, even if its exports go down a bunch. And by the way, at $63 billion, that would be almost twice as much as Iran earned from oil exports in 2015, 2016. So anyway, enough about that. Let me talk about Iran. I don't want to shock you, but in Iran, as in many places, most politics is local, and people really are not fixated on the JCPOA as such. Neither is the political elite. The issue which matters to the political elite in Iran is very much the succession to the supreme leader, a process which has already started. That position is the big prize, and Khamenei is not allowed there to emerge any successor, and that he's not going to allow any successor to emerge. That's just not his style, and so when he passes from the scene without a successor, the people who are in good position to move quickly to reinforce and expand their power are the Revolutionary Guards. And the clerics are largely irrelevant, and the technocrats, moderates, whatever you want to call them, have done an impressive job at weakening their own position. The IRGC has gotten there by playing on its strength, and its strength has been Iran's regional policy, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Yemen, Iran's regional policy has been the single greatest success the Islamic Republic has had in its 40 years, considering all foreign and domestic issues. And that fact helps explain why the Revolutionary Guards continue to be very bold in what they've been doing. It's not just those missiles against Israel. It's also providing Houthis with what are obviously Iranian-made missiles for attacks on Riyadh. All it's going to take is one of those things to hit in the royal palace or a plane at the airport, and the Saudis will be in a pickle. They'll have to respond somehow. So I think we should anticipate that there's going to be more such bold actions that the Revolutionary Guards sponsor. And that, frankly, probably would have been true no matter what happened to the JCPOA. Yes, the withdrawal from the JCPOA removes one potential constraint upon these actions, but frankly, that had not stopped the Revolutionary Guards from providing missiles for attacks against Riyadh, even though UN experts came along and said, yeah, these are Iranian missiles. And it had not stopped the Revolutionary Guards from launching a drone against an armed drone, the IDF now tells us, against Israel. So I know that there's a narrative in some quarters that these attacks are related to the withdrawal from the JCPOA. That's a stretch, folks. That these attacks this bold policy was well underway before the withdrawal from the JCPOA. I know there's some hope that that domestic reaction will limit this. Don't count on it. Fact is that one of the characteristics of Iran the last 5 years has been impressive growth in nationalism. And there are a lot of Iranians who are pleased to see someone who's making Iran great again. They just don't want to pay for it. Sound familiar? But the IRGC model is pretty cheap. It really is remarkably cheap, especially compared to the American model of how we help our allies. And the Iraq example is as a case in point because it largely pays for itself. The IRGC is able to make enough money off of graft and various other things in Iraq to largely pay for their ventures there.
The nuclear issue is much riskier for the IRGC compared to regional policy. First off, the signs of success will not be as obvious unless they do something really like explode a bomb.
Also, the action on the nuclear front does stir up people's fear of a war. So I'm not as convinced that the Revolutionary Guards are going to press for there being a bold action on the nuclear front. I mean, it's not the obvious winner that regional policy is, I'll put it that way. For a long time, the Revolutionary Guards have been trying to keep attention away from their domestic role because their corruption and their cronyism is their Achilles heel. And their corruption and cronyism provided the opening with which people like Rouhani and his technocrats and moderates could go after the IRGC. Rouhani has done a wonderful job of making sure that he's in no position to benefit from his criticisms of the IRGC because he has mismanaged the economy as badly as they have. Rouhani made a promise during his first election campaign that he knew how to return the country to rapid economic growth. And the formula that he recommended, which was end the nuclear crisis and then attract foreign investment, was wrong. It was wrong because Iran is simply not prepared to open up to foreign investment. And Iran retained a great many of bureaucratic restrictions and a great deal of corruption, which discouraged foreign investors. And residual U.S. sanctions certainly played a role here, but to be frank, it was the domestic corruption and bureaucratic muddle. This is well illustrated by what's happened to the banking system. After a decade in which we have seen a lot of banking crises around the world, and we have a lot of experience with how to deal with banking crises, it is impressive to see how Iran has done everything wrong about its banking crisis. and has managed to take what was really kind of a garden-style banking crisis, certainly nothing like what Greece went or Ireland went through, and just an order of magnitude less than what Cyprus or Iceland went through. The Iranians have managed to make this into something which really has weakened people's confidence in the banking system. To give you one example, Iran a few years ago introduced a deposit insurance system for the first time for depositors and banks, but it only applies to banks which have no risk of failing and does not apply to the banks which actually might fail. And so therefore, people have gotten nervous about the banking system and have been taking money out of it.
Furthermore, Rouhani has gotten criticized for the things he's done right. And in particular, letting the currency drop in value. I'm showing my IMF roots here. But the decision by the Canadian and Russian governments a few years ago when the price of oil fell to allow their respective currencies to depreciate in value by more than 30% means that neither of those two countries entered into a deep recession after the price of oil. Their principal export fell, and has helped explain how they've been able to get through the what really is quite a shock to their economies reasonably well. Shockingly enough, Ahmadinejad did much the same thing. So when the last round of economic sanctions hit and then the price of oil fell, Iran's budget revenues in dollar terms from oil dropped by 60%, but its real revenues actually rose slightly because Ahmadinejad allowed the currency to depreciate that much. And that meant that there wasn't the kind of huge budget deficit that there otherwise would have been. And it also meant that it discouraged imports and encouraged exports and helped domestic producers. So anyway, Rouhani's getting a lot of criticism. There's rumors today the central bank governor may have to resign. And in general, he's not looking like a winner. There was an article in the Iranian press 2 weeks ago that drew a great deal of attention. It was called "In Defense of a Military President," arguing that what Iran needs is a military president like Reza Shah, who, after all, someone said what the article said was they needed Reza Shah Hezbollah-y. Mm-hmm. So that's the elite politics. It's concerned with succession. Rouhani's not doing so well, and the Revolutionary Guards is doing very well. For popular politics, the populace is fixated on the country's economic problems. We saw that in the protests earlier this year. We've seen it in a continuing stream of protests.
But the fundamental fact is that nobody's got a plan. Nobody's got an idea of who could run things better. And it's hard to have a major soccer match these days in Iran without somebody picking up a chant to bring back the Shah or bring back Reza Shah, who just because he's dead, so what? And that's because it's a sign of how desperate people are. They have no confidence in the system. It's very different from the situation that we saw in 2013, when it was possible for Rouhani to go to the supreme leader and to go to the people and say, change policies and I can restore hope. That does not exist today. And that's going to make it a much tougher for us to persuade anybody to come to negotiations, right? Because back in 2013, Rouhani was saying, hey, look, put me in charge, I'll go to negotiations and I'll solve your economic problems. Nobody believes that now. So I will just leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Kate?
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Mike. Good afternoon. So as Mike said, what we know now is that the president has announced that the U.S. is withdrawing from the nuclear deal, and that rather than what some may have expected, that this would be a soft withdrawal or a partial withdrawal, that instead the U.S. is withdrawing completely. And from a sanctions perspective, that means returning to primarily to the sanctions infrastructure that was in place before the deal. So I think it's helpful to look at, to understand what this means by looking first at what relief was extended. When the Iran deal went into effect, the change in sanctions policy was perhaps the largest one-day change in U.S. sanctions policy ever. That being said, because the scope of the deal was limited and it pertained only to the nuclear program and the relief was only from nuclear-related sanctions, a number of U.S. sanctions remained in place. The bulk of the relief that was delivered, therefore, came from relief from the energy sanctions and other secondary sanctions, meaning those that target not just Iranian entities, but those that do business with them. And to be kind of more specific or technical, it was that financial institutions that engage in significant transactions with designated Iranian entities risk losing their access to the U.S. financial system. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. Because the relief primarily came from relieving these secondary sanctions, reimposing them, therefore, impacts those who looks to disrupt those third country businesses, financial institutions, firms, oil importers who re-engaged since the sanctions relief went into effect. What the U.S. Treasury has said since the announcement on Tuesday is they've put out a list of frequently asked questions that begin to detail how they plan to implement a wind-down period for that activity. And they've laid out 2 wind-down periods. One will be 90 days and a concurrent 180-day period, saying that after 90 days, certain restrictive measures will go back into place. These are some of the kind of easier measures to re-implement. And after at 180 days, that effectively all of the sanctions that had been lifted will again be in full effect. So this includes the energy sanctions and sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran. And if you recall, countries were able to get an exemption from the central bank sanctions by significantly reducing the amount of oil that they imported from Iran, and then they would be given a waiver to continue to be able to make those payments through the central bank, as well as sanctions on the shipping, shipbuilding, and automotive sectors of the Iranian economy. In addition to that, there were about 400 individuals and entities who were removed from U.S. sanctions list as part of the relief. A large portion of those are Iranian entities that are identified as being part of the government of Iran or affiliated with them. Those were not completely relieved from sanctions. They were still subject to the U.S. primary embargo. And as such, relisting them is really not a big technical feat or bureaucratic feat. But the other entities that were listed under behavior-based programs, for example, for their ties to the nuclear program, there will need to be an effort to relist them and add them back to U.S. sanctions lists. So just a quick word about the primary embargo, which stayed mostly in effect with limited exceptions, and those were the allowance of imports of Iranian carpets and foodstuffs. Second one was a general license that allowed foreign subsidiaries of U.S. firms to re-engage in Iran. But perhaps most notable was a license that allowed for the sale of civilian commercial aircraft and parts to Iran. And this is the license under which Boeing and Airbus, of course, struck a major deal with Iran since the relief went into effect. And this is a license that will go away, according to the guidance put out by OFAC this week. So, well, from a broad technical perspective, the infrastructure will return pretty basically to what it was before. The administration actually has a lot of decisions to make. From a practical perspective, they need not implement the sanctions the way they did exactly, and there may be reasons not to do so. It may make sense to do things differently because the vulnerabilities have changed. The sanctions architecture that was built up over a number of years was done by looking specifically at what measures would create the kind of pressure that policymakers were looking to achieve. And it may not look the same as it did 5, 6, 7, even 8 years ago when these sanctions were first put into place. It may also not make sense there may also be places where the administration should be looking to use discretion in order to avoid some potential diplomatic train wrecks. One situation, potential challenge that comes to mind is with the reimposition of sanctions on specialized financial messaging services. So these were the sanctions on the SWIFT, which is a messaging platform that banks use to communicate with each other, and it's Belgian-based. And it was a political agreement under which both the U.S. and the EU put in place sanctions that caused SWIFT to basically take Iranian banks off of their system. It was a major. It was something that Iranians sought to get back on as part of the relief, but re-implementing those sanctions on messaging services will be a challenge because, of course, there's not political unity, there's not diplomatic unity on this front, and because SWIFT is a consortium. So that's a potential challenge. So two areas, though, where the administration has a fair amount of discretion, actually two specific ones, is how they interpret and implement the definitions both of significant transaction. As I mentioned before, this is a key term in the criteria that's used for secondary sanctions. There's a fair amount of discretion on that. The Secretary of the Treasury can consider this was guidance that was put out by the previous administration. That may even be changeable, but under the previous guidance, the Secretary was able to consider the size, number, frequency, type, complexity, commercial purpose, level of awareness of the bank's management, the ultimate economic benefit, a variety of things that do give the administration the ability to interpret whatever activity they see and use some discretion there. Another one is the definition of significant reduction. So in order to get that waiver from sanctions for countries that import Iranian oil, they have to significantly reduce the amount that they're importing. And the previous administration did have a definition for that. This administration is not necessarily required to use the same. So what this comes down to is an important political decision on how vigorously the administration plans to enforce these sanctions. While the president has said that he wants to create maximum pressure, it may make sense to look at where either waiving, licensing, or making a political commitment not to implement sanctions would be worthwhile on a political front, and also where it might not have a significant impact on the policy objective, meaning exactly what kind of pressure is going to build, or could be delayed. And I think that's something that we saw last time around in trying to build pressure on Iran, that delaying action sometimes gave time to create the correct political dynamic in order to have it be a more joint action rather than unilateral. So the EU, of course, is looking to minimize the fallout from the re-implementation of sanctions, and they're looking to do that both for their own firms, but also in order to retain the benefit to Iran, right? Because Iran has said at this point that they will stay in the deal as long as they see the benefit from it. And I think it's worth noting that those may not always be the same thing. So if you look at some of the actions that are under consideration by different European leaders, both on the political front and to a certain extent on the commercial front, for example, export guarantees. This would protect European firms, but won't necessarily give Iran the benefit in terms of foreign direct investment that they're looking for. When the Europeans look to protect some of the kind of the largest investments that European countries have made in Iran since the deal went into effect, they may have a tough case. They may have a tough time making the case to the Trump administration that withdrawing from these deals would cause extraordinary commercial or financial damage. The Airbus deal, for example, Boeing and Airbus, the backlog of the amount that they would make from these deals is reportedly less than 2% of their production backlog. So that's not a significant amount. Total and its investment in South Pars has reportedly only spent hundreds of millions of dollars and not the billion that it was committed to initially. So while this will be an uphill battle, no doubt the Trump administration may want to find ways to use discretion there to make concessions to the Europeans and minimize the fallout. When they do this, though, just a few recommendations before I conclude, that the administration should strive for maximum clarity. So there are some people who have argued that leaving the rules going forward on the sanctions front vague would be beneficial under the theory that in this area of de-risking, where banks are incredibly risk averse, that everyone would just opt to forego Iranian business altogether. I would argue, however, that this would undermine our efforts to get our allies and other partners on the same page and risk more of a backlash and efforts to find workarounds, not just from Iran sanctions, but also from the U.S. financial system. And I think we saw some of this in press this morning. The European officials were saying that they needed to find a way to be financially independent from U.S. unilateral use of these tools. That's not only bad for our efforts on Iran, but that undermines sanctions as a policy tool across the board and threatens our ability to use them in other contexts. Finally, the impact of sanctions, especially in this context, but more broadly, depends on the actions of firms. And outreach to the private sector has been a key component both of the initial Iran constriction campaign and even in the lead up to the implementation of the relief, so that the private sector understood the terms of what would be allowed and what is not allowed. And that'll be equally important in this round to make sure that there's that understanding. Because the firms, especially given the lack of political unity, explaining to firms both what they can and cannot do will make it more likely that they will comply across the board. And finally, it's not just important that there's clarity in terms of what the rules are, but also on the narrative. And I just wanted to point out that we already saw yesterday a new action come out. There was a Treasury designation under non-nuclear authorities, so the authorities that still remained in place even when the deal was there, that I think is an effort that reminds me kind of the early days of the sanctions campaign to really tie together Iranian bad actors and their sanctions evasion kind of typologies to send a message just about how dangerous this activity is. And what this sanction was is it targeted an exchange network that was being operated by the IRGC Quds Force, and it tied the Central Bank of Iran directly to this network, saying that the Central Bank of Iran had given the Quds Force access to its bank accounts containing Iranian oil revenues to use to try to deceptively procure U.S. dollars in order to support proxies and other terrorist organizations in the region. And so I think these are all of the themes in terms of rebuilding a narrative where you see action in response to specific Iranian behavior. And that in the past has been kind of the foundation of building these multilateral efforts. So I think with that is a good segue for Mike to tell us where we're going to go on the diplomatic front.
All right. Thank you, Kate. And I should say as an aside that one of the things that makes me proud of the Washington Institute and of my colleagues is, this is an issue where there are real passions on both sides, obviously, that have been stirred by the president's decision. It's an issue where there's a lot of advocacy and activism. But I think that one thing that these guys do is they bring real expertise and pragmatism and professionalism to bear on these very sensitive issues. And I think that that's rare, frankly, in Washington. I want to talk a bit about sort of what motivated the decision and where do we go. As far as I can tell, if we put politics aside, I'm not a political expert, and so I won't comment on that. As I look at the substance, there are perhaps three things which played into this decision to withdraw from the JCPOA. The first, very simply, were concerns about the substance of the JCPOA itself. Obviously, we'd heard time and again, both from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, as well as from U.S. officials, that Iran had been complying largely with the JCPOA. I think the concern in the U.S. government was not Iran's compliance, but it was the deal itself, the sense that the deal did too little for too little time to restrict Iran's concerning behaviors, especially its nuclear behavior, in exchange for sanctions relief that was too broad and too lasting, too long in duration, essentially. So that dissatisfaction obviously has its roots in the very polarized debate in 2015 about the JCPOA, where you had really almost unanimous opposition, I think actually unanimous opposition from Republicans on the Hill as well as from Republican presidential candidates who were joined even by a few Democrats. And so in a sense, it's not surprising now that a Republican administration joined by a Republican-dominated Congress would decide that they didn't want to stay in the deal. Second, the second substantive issue, I think, was this sense that Patrick was alluding to, that the Iranian regime is vulnerable right now, economically, politically, and so forth. And it's vulnerable just at a time when U.S. policymakers are scrambling for tools to counter Iran's regional aggression. A lot of those tools were not available because of our obligations under the JCPOA, and frankly, now they are available. And then third, I think there's a North Korea angle to this as well, which partly explains the timing of the president's announcement, which came 4 days before it was necessary, in a sense. And I think that there is a desire to project by the Trump administration this sense that we won't be taken for a ride, as it were, as we enter into these North Korean negotiations. And perhaps senior policymakers see this as a way to project that. Just speaking analytically, as far as I can tell, these are the sort of some of the factors went into this decision. And I think what the Trump administration has in mind is to try to replicate what it considers the North Korea model with Iran. And that model, in a sense, in a nutshell, is maximum pressure, quote unquote, combined with a willingness and opening to get involved in sort of these broad negotiations with the counterpart. We have President Trump in just about a month's time sitting down with Kim Jong-un to, of course, discuss the whole kit and caboodle of issues which stand between the U.S. and North Korea. And the view in the administration is that it was the maximum pressure campaign that brought that result about. Now, I should say, as an aside, that is by far not a unanimous view analytically. Obviously, a lot of people would say that no, Kim is actually coming to the table because he's developed nuclear-armed ICBMs, and he believes that it's sort of that development which has brought the United States into the summit. I imagine that President Trump and Kim Jong-un will agree to disagree about that, and negotiations will go from there. So this, I think, is really the model. What are the prospects for success? Kate discussed a lot of the questions about sanctions implementation. But I just want to point out, based upon personal experience, I was involved at the outset of trying to put together the sanctions on Iran starting in 2006. Not the original sanctions, that was 1979 or 1980. I was young then. But these financial market-based sanctions on Iranian banks, shipping, insurance, and so on and so forth. I think one thing which isn't often recognized is that these are not sanctions on autopilot. It's not as though these were just adopted and then kind of worked. There was a tremendous amount of diplomacy which went into enforcing these sanctions. And Kate was part of that. My colleague Matt Levitt, who's in the back, was part of that. And there was an enormous bureaucracy that was a part of that effort. And in order to accomplish it, we adopted a series of UN Security Council resolutions, which really laid the diplomatic foundation for then a more ad hoc campaign of sanctions outreach. And we also combined the pressure track against Iran with a diplomatic track. And those UN Security Council resolutions and that diplomatic process were really key to gaining the buy-in of our European allies as well as the Russians and Chinese. Remember, the Russians and Chinese voted for I think 5 or 6 UN Security Council resolutions against Iran. We've seen that in the North Korea context as well, where, yes, there has been maximum pressure due to, in part, to secondary sanctions, but there have also been UN Security Council resolutions which have facilitated that process. This is going to be more difficult than that. There won't be UN Security Council resolutions. I'd be willing to place a bet on that. I don't think China and Russia are going to be going for that anytime soon. And during that period, from 2006 to 2013, we had this strategic alignment with allies, which is now not present. I think the European allies will be upset, first and foremost, that we abandoned the agreement and that we abandoned the U.S. E3 talks, which were really close to accomplishing what they were set out to accomplish. They'll also be focused, first and foremost, on mollifying Iran and trying to keep the JCPOA together. One of the ironies right now is that the leverage that we were seeking to use, that is to use other countries' desire to keep the U.S. in the JCPOA, has shifted in a sense to Iran. Now those countries want to keep Iran in the JCPOA, and this gives Iran a bit of leverage to negotiate for itself a sweeter deal. And we've already heard from the Iranians that they seek to do this, and obviously that process will be a bit at odds in our effort to reimpose sanctions. Russia and China, for their part, as I mentioned, are in just a totally different place now than they were in 2006 when we started this process the first time around. So this is really going to be, if you put aside the Cuba and Libya examples, which are from a bit further in the past at a very different era for sanctions, the first time we've sought to erect this kind of secondary sanctions regime amid such a sharp strategic divergence with our allies. And so we don't really know how it's going to go. Nevertheless, I think it's safe to say, and Kate alluded to this, multinational firms will be inclined to go along, whether they like it or not, because they face the prospect of loss of access to the U.S. market, which is not a small thing by any means. However, that will be diluted, as my sort of sanctions expert colleagues can tell you, by the inevitable cheating and workarounds and resistance from state-owned firms who face different incentives and governments, of course. And that's where the diplomacy comes in. You really need sanctions diplomacy to translate the pressure of sanctions into policy outcomes. You need sanctions diplomacy also to manage the policy trade-offs, because if you look at, for example, Iran's biggest oil customers, it's states like China, where we're also trying to work with them on North Korea. We've got teams going over to deal with sanctions and economic issues. You kind of throw this into the mix, and you need to decide how to prioritize. Number two is India. India is a country which we see as a key ally in our Indo-Pacific strategy. And so, again, we'll have to try to somehow square this sanctions effort with that. Turkey is Iran's third largest oil customer, and many of you, if you've attended our events before, watched our events before, will know that we do have some tensions right now with the Turks on other issues. So these are policy trade-offs which have to be managed at a very high level and where a strategy is really needed to be sort of plotted out. And so I just have three recommendations, essentially, for the U.S. government on these things. Number one, I would keep, frankly, open the U.S. E3 talks that had been going on up until the president's announcements on the JCPOA. If we could still reach some kind of accord with the E3, the British, the French, and the Germans, then I think it's worth doing, and I think it's worth considering deferring the sanctions or giving exemptions to the sanctions if we can do that. Because in a sense, our top priority here will need to be closing the gap, mending the rifts between ourselves and our allies as a foundation for whatever we plan to do next. Whether it's a foundation simply for implementing sanctions against Iran, or it's a foundation for this broader negotiation the president seems to have in mind. It would be tough to do that if we're standing alone, and it also would be senseless in a sense to discard the good work that's been done over the past 12 months. The fact is that the Trump administration succeeded in generating a very constructive conversation about issues that we have long sought European cooperation on. Iran's ballistic missile program, Iran's regional activities, Iran's support for terrorism, and so forth. It would be a shame to simply cast that aside. Number two, I think that we also need to put this decision on the JCPOA in the context of a broader Iran strategy, which so far has been lacking. It was also lacking under the Obama administration. Basically, give a sense of what is it we seek to accomplish vis-a-vis Iran in a broader sense. How does that fit into a Middle East strategy? So the conversation isn't really just about sanctions alone, but is about outcomes that our allies may in fact share. I I don't think we are alone in wanting to push back Iran's regional aggression. I know that we're not alone in that, in fact. I know we're not alone in trying to counter Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. Now, perhaps we might face some sharp disagreements over the tactics, but if we can at least articulate a comprehensive strategy, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, then it's a basis, perhaps, for a more constructive discussion. Third, we'll need a diplomatic roadshow to explain that policy, excuse me, to explain that policy, to explain the road ahead to all of our international partners, to make specific requests to them, not just announcing the reimposition of sanctions, but explaining what we would like them to do in that regard, listen to their concerns so that we're not inadvertently compromising the security or economies of our allies, and hopefully starting then to gain some buy-in from them, or at least diminish their opposition to what we're doing and diminish those rifts which could be exploited by our adversaries. So, excuse me, 3 recommendations for the road ahead. I'm not sure yet whether the Trump administration plans to take that sort of route. I think right now, behind closed doors, I imagine there's a lot of deliberation about exactly where are we going to go from here. And of course, they're having to do that amid a relatively crowded national security agenda, which has North Korea right at the top of it. So with that, we'd like to start the Q&A. I may start with a couple of questions of my own for my colleagues here, but I would encourage all of you to think about the questions you might ask. If you're watching on live stream, I'm not sure exactly how we do this, but if you have a question you want to tweet or something like that, we can try to field it. And I would just remind everybody as we do that we are, in fact, on the record, and this is being streamed live. So when you formulate your own comments, please bear that in mind. I want to ask first, Patrick, let's get back to the sort of regime change question, because it has come up a lot, especially in the media. I'm not going to ask you to predict whether the regime is about to fall, because I think such predictions are pretty tough. But we do see this economic fragility. We have seen political turbulence in Iran. What are the signs that you would be looking for that the regime was in real trouble?
Well, one important sign which we have seen in the last few months is a loss of confidence. And it's possible to hear on Iranian state television commentators saying that the regime might collapse. Now, that's new. We have not heard that for 39 years. They're saying, nah, it's not going to happen. But look. Or the other day when Rouhani was giving his comments after the JCPOA withdrawal announcement, so I'm reading his speech on his website in Persian, and I came across this lovely line. The President of the Republic emphasized to the people that there is no need whatsoever to worry about the future of the country. Excuse me, when the president says there's no reason to worry about the future of the country, there's every reason to worry about the future of the country, right? So I would say loss of confidence is an important thing, and it's palpable. It's palpable. And this article calling for a military president, which was widely discussed and widely commented on. I mean, excuse me, you're calling for a Reza Shah? By the way, the genius who wrote this article, just to show his knowledge of European history, he gave 2 examples of people who he thought had done a good job of taking over and running things, and they were Napoleon and Hitler, both of whom led their countries into prolonged wars in which millions of people died, and the country ended up being a lot smaller than it was previously. Right? But there is no opposition figure which anybody can rally around, and that's the obvious problem. So what comes next, right? What comes next? And if we saw anybody gaining traction of that sort, then I would worry. By the way, my forecast, if there's going to be, there's going to be regime change because Khamenei is going to pass on the scene. We're going to have a very different regime after Khamenei. I think the most likely scenario by far for regime change is that we get a worse regime, that we get what's happened in a number of other ideologically oriented Middle Eastern revolutionary states, which is that the revolution decays and is replaced by a military-run regime that is venal and corrupt and claims to continue the revolutionary policies. That was true in Egypt, it was true in Iraq, it was true in Syria, and I think that's the most likely scenario for Iran. And that policy like that would, I think, be every bit as aggressive and assertive in foreign policy as the previous examples I just cited were. So I do think there's a distinct chance of regime change. It'll be worse.
Well, how uplifting. All right, so Kate, obviously we've heard a lot about EU ministers talking about how they can resist U.S. sanctions, essentially. We've heard about blocking statutes. You mentioned the idea of export guarantees. Reciprocal tariffs are obviously another tool, perhaps the nuclear option, as it were, for the EU. What do you expect to come of all of this? Do you think that, given that there is now this strategic divergence between the U.S. and EU, that, in fact, the EU will be able to do anything meaningful to prevent their companies from complying with the sanctions to preserve trade with Iran, or do you think it'll all come to naught?
I think that what I think is most likely, as I mentioned, I think is government to government dialogue on how to seek waivers and licenses or commitments not to enforce certain sanctions. I think that the options that the Europeans have to try to insulate themselves from these sanctions are that they don't have a lot of good options. I think in some of the reporting I've read out of Europe in the last few days, I think there's a number of misconceptions. One is that by avoiding the U.S. dollar, firms could avoid being sanctioned, and that's not necessarily the case. A significant transaction doesn't have to be in dollars to make it sanctionable. So firms or financial institutions that may have little connection to the U.S. or need to be in the U.S. markets might feel less pressure to comply with the sanctions, but large firms can't insulate themselves from being cut off from the U.S. by not using U.S. dollars. The sanctions could still apply. I think one of the other misconceptions is what it is exactly at stake. And I've seen some people confuse some of the large enforcement actions against banks, like BNP Paribas, that was fined I think at $1.9 billion a few years ago, with 9.4. Okay, but a very large fine.
A few $1 billion between friends.
Yeah. But there have been a number of these very large fines against Western banks for violating U.S. sanctions. That's not what we're talking about. This is a cutoff of correspondent relationships, meaning that these large financial institutions would no longer be able to use the U.S. dollar, not a financial penalty, but an actual sanction. They're different kinds of actions. So I think that they don't have a lot of good options in terms of insulating themselves. I think even if you look at the Chinese, what's interesting, there's been some talk that if Total were to pull out of its investment in South Pars, that its Chinese partner could potentially take over the rest of it, as if the Chinese company wouldn't also be as vulnerable to sanctions. They indeed would. I think there's some analysis that thinks that some Chinese companies would be less vulnerable because they have fewer ties to the U.S. But the large Chinese firms, including the Total's partner, I believe it's CNCP or PC. CNPC does in fact have U.S. operations. And if you look that ZTE, another large Chinese firm, was hit last month by sanctions by the Commerce Department and given a multi-year ban on access to U.S. parts, and announced this week that it's shutting down production because it can't produce its goods without access to the U.S. So, in fact, Chinese companies are also more vulnerable than the conventional wisdom may think they are. So I think there are a few good options short of engaging in government-to-government discussions.
If I may I don't think that's a good option either. Because the government-to-government negotiations do not include the actors who really matter and have to make the decisions, which are the private companies. And I don't think the private companies are necessarily going to think that the deal that's been worked out by the government of their country is going to protect them from adverse reactions in the future by the United States government. So, I think that if I were chief financial officer of, chief legal officer of any major corporation outside the United States, I would say, screw it. I don't care what our government agrees to. It's not going to help us in the least. And so, therefore, I'd say it's just not worth it. It's not worth it. We are in an environment in the last 10 years of which companies are de-risking, right? Talk to the officials of the UN, how hard it is to get any bank to open an account for UN missions. Banks don't want to run risk. Major corporations don't want to run risk. And I don't care what their national governments can tell them. I just don't think they're going to feel comfortable that any deal that's worked out is actually going to protect them.
If I could just add to that, I think it's not just banks. And so I think there has been a lot of focus on banks. But you have to think that financial services actually go much further, and that these sanctions apply to insurance and reinsurance as well. And that's especially of interest in the shipping industry. And so when you see these sanctions reimposed on a RISL, which is Iran's shipping line, for example, they will lose insurance. Others involved in the shipping industry who might be shipping goods to or from Iran would risk losing their insurance. And this will make it so even if you could find banks that were isolated that didn't have a need to be integrated into the U.S. financial system, if you have activity that requires shipping and it requires insurance, they'll have problems getting that. And even if the financing is squared away, for example, by a European bank that could be insulated from the U.S.
Got it. Okay. Well, so with that, we're happy to take your questions. And as I said, please do feel free to tweet at us if you're watching online and have a question. So let's start in the front, and then we'll move to the second row here. And please do identify yourself.
Michael Kurtzig, retired from U.S. Department of Agriculture. 2 quick points and a question over here. Pat or Kate, is this a declaration of war by the U.S. administration against Iran? What I mean by that is, the bottom line is, Iran is in Yemen with Houthis shooting rockets to Saudi Arabia. Of course, they're in Lebanon with Hezbollah. They're in Syria with Hezbollah, fighting Israel to some extent, and of course the Revolutionary Guard being in Syria, shooting rockets into the Golan Heights. In Iraq, there's also a problem. So is there something, as Michael Duran said a couple of days ago, at the Hudson, we've been at war with Iran since 1979. In fact, is this a policy now to contain this terrorist organization, this terrorist regime, and to stop them? And the second question I have is this, Pat, more for you, as I was the Iran desk officer for years in the 1970s, and that is, do the sanctions include food? Because Iran at that time was a huge importer of rice, of wheat, of chicken, of feed grains, of soybeans, whatever it is. What is the condition? Because you spoke about the embargo, which will be an embargo on their carpets, pistachios and other stuff, the best pistachios in the world. There used to be once upon a time. Is that also included in those sanctions? Thank you.
Well, on the first point, the JCPOA talking points the White House sent around say that President Trump is making clear that in addition to never developing a nuclear weapon, the Iranian regime must cease its support for terrorists, extremists, and regional proxies such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda, and its publicly declared quest to destroy Israel. Forget it. Forget it. If that, in fact, is the U.S. position, then there will not be an agreement. But, of course, Trump was talking about a return to negotiations with Iran and wanting a better and bigger deal. So, I don't know how much flexibility there is in the U.S. position, but if the United States thinks that there's any possibility it can achieve those objectives, forget it. Ain't going to happen, right? And if there is interest in a bigger and better deal, that might be achievable some point down the road, but it's certainly not going to be a deal that includes those kinds of terms.
food sanctions? Do you know?
So it appears that the licenses for humanitarian and food stuff will remain in place. There's been no specific mention of them in the guidance in there. It's policies that go across sanctions program that the import of food is allowed, and there's a few others on communication devices and things like that. There's no indication yet that those will be that those licenses will be revoked either. But they just haven't fleshed out that part of it. But I would expect that the general license for food commodities would remain. They would continue to be able to import them.
Indeed, it's my reading of the International Economic Emergency Powers Act that, as revised by Congress a number of years ago, it took away the president's right to sanction foods and to sanction a whole variety of educational exchanges and so on and so forth. So the kind of restrictions we have on with Cuba and with North Korea from before those cannot be applied in the future.
On the first question, just very briefly, I've heard it said that we've been at war with Iran since 1979. Of course, we've also avoided a war with Iran since 1979. You look at it both ways. And the best book on this is by one of our former colleagues, David Christ, who's a historian at the Pentagon, who wrote something called The Twilight War, about all the low-level conflict which has taken place with the Iranians since 1979. I think to me, one question that really is unanswered is U.S. policy now going to consist only of sanctions, which is really a sort of arm's length way of dealing with Iran without sort of really having to get your hands dirty in the Middle East, in a sense, because we haven't seen an increased willingness to counter Iran in places like Syria or Iraq or Yemen and so forth. And so this is one of the unanswered questions that we'll have to wait and see. Are we still planning on withdrawing those 2,000 troops from Syria? Are we planning on doing what a lot of our allies in the region would like us to do and taking action to stop Iran from entrenching itself in western Syria, for example? These questions aren't answered, and right now all we really have is a sense that there will be new sanctions. So in the second row.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sylwia Szafowska from the Polish Embassy, and I would like to ask you two questions. First is about the process of the State Department and UN. Will the U.S. try to invoke snapback sanctions to use the dispute resolution mechanism? What do you envisage in this term? Because it's a unilateral decision in a multilateral agreement. So it's the first question. And second, what will be the impact on cooperation with Russia? Do you think regionally, will it invigorate the Iranian-Russian cooperation in Syria and some other? And what will be the future of civilian nuclear cooperation, civilian nuclear program for Iran?
On the first one, I am told on very good authority by the administration that their attitude is that the United States is withdrawn from the JCPOA, that is no longer a part of the JCPOA, and that therefore no longer can invoke the provisions in UN Security Council Resolution 2231 for snapback. So no, there will not be any snapback of UN sanctions. U.S. position is we walked away from the deal. We're not violating the deal. We're not alleging Iran violated the deal. We're walking away from it. So there will be no UN snapback. However, certain things will remain in place, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, I'd be interested in your answer about what happens if Iran wants to import things for nuclear safety within the framework of the JCPOA. What's the U.S. attitude about that? I suspect the answer, by the way, preempt Kate, I suspect that the United States would give a license for it.
So I would just add what I think Patrick's talking about is there's a part of the JCPOA called the procurement channel, and it's a set of rules that allows Iran to make requests for goods it needs for its civilian nuclear program. And the U.S. has participated in the past, and presumably, if is not part of the JCPOA, will no longer participate. But although the procurement channel got off to a slow start, it's picked up in its activity. There have been more requests that have been approved through the committee there for Iran to get the things it needs under a controlled process, with end-use verifications in theory. And so that has picked up its pace, and I think it would be worthwhile to see it maintained as long as the deal is in place.
The question about Iran-Russia cooperation, it's an interesting question because I think we had seen already in the post-JCPOA period that Iranian cooperation with Russia had dramatically increased. And I think that is, in a sense, just a continuation of a longer-term trend, and you could say the same about Iran-China cooperation, but also because the JCPOA freed Russia up, in a sense, to engage in certain forms of cooperation with Iran that might have been more difficult in the past. I would say I certainly don't think that the decision to withdraw from the JCPOA is going to halt that trend that we've already seen. It seems likely, and it seems like this could be another point of tension between the U.S. and Russia, again, because we'll be trying to enforce sanctions which may apply to Iran-Russia cooperation. But you heard this very much from the Iranian leadership over the course of the past year, this idea that the Supreme Leader put out of basically looking east to expand Iran's relations because of the notion that expanding economic and diplomatic relations to the West simply hadn't panned out in the way that President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif had suggested that it would. More questions? Yes, sir. Here.
Thanks very much for the presentations. Mike Kraft, I worked on sanctions against Iran when I was in the State Department Counterterrorism Office, and before that on the Hill. And one of the big problems was companies would often try to get around our licensing things through cutouts, sending aircraft spare parts through a third country, etc. So I'm wondering if we have these more difficult relations with the European allies, are we going to have more difficulties in trying to get them to cooperate and trying to catch these so-called cheaters? And what sectors do you think in the secondary boycott range might be most prominent or difficult? For example, in agriculture equipment or oil equipment, etc. Because it seems to me that, as somebody talked about the need for diplomacy, we're going to have a lot of difficulties in enforcing secondary boycotts in certain sectors. But are there some that you think are more prominent problems or potential problems?
So I think on the first question about evasion, no doubt that Iran, has been under sanctions for, almost 4 decades, has developed a very sophisticated sanctions evasion capability, and that remained in place after the relief was put into effect. Because one of the challenges I think they faced was, without being fully integrated into the global financial system, they couldn't scale back their reliance on their evasion network, that they continued to use it, and there were a number of signs of that. Most recently, there was a kind of dust-up with the Chinese. In fact, the Chinese were not paying for some of their petrochemical imports because they were not, the bills of ladings said the UAE and not Iran, and they said, well, this is deceptive. We can't complete these payments. It was the banks who were about to undergo their own FATF evaluation soon in China. But so there's signs they continue to rely on this. And that is, it's a catch-22. That's part of why banks wouldn't reengage. I think the financial sector is very sensitive to not wanting to be involved in evasion, and is actually quite good at identifying it. Seeing directionality of trade that doesn't make sense or other suspicious behaviors. So I think that it's definitely something of concern, because it will help Iran evade these sanctions like they have in the past. But one that we're getting better at countering as well. And the second question,
which sectors are most likely to be difficult?
So I think that's a good question. When the more sectoral sanctions went into place previously, there were already so many other restrictions that I don't think you saw a big delta. There wasn't a lot of remaining activity to be cut off, and so it's hard to look at previous experience and see what sectors will be most affected. But you do have, the ones that come to mind are the sectors where you've seen European companies re-engage, the automotive sector, for example. I think there's also a fair amount of imports of German goods used in construction and things like that. So those are the ones that come to mind.
I'll say just on the question about difficulty. When we were initially devising the sanctions, and perhaps you have some experience with this yourself, we would think about things like, number one, sort of how important was a particular sector to Iran? How much would it bite? Second, how exposed was that sector to, say, the U.S. market? So if you take a look at, for example, reinsurance and so forth, you have a sector which is concentrated, a lot of exposure to Western markets and so forth. In contrast, maybe to, say, I don't know, you think of other industries where you might have a lot of different companies, a lot of which didn't really do much business with the United States and so forth. We'd also have to think about kind of blowback for the United States of actually enacting sanctions. That obviously comes into play very much in the oil sector, where you worry that not only will you potentially have an impact on oil price, and you'll work to mitigate that, say by working with the Saudis to increase their supply, you also worry about the impact of the actual mechanism you're using, which might be sanctions on the central bank of another country. And some of these countries, obviously, sanctioning their central bank would have far-reaching implications for the United States' relationship with that country. Patrick, you were going to chime in with something.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. There was a delicious interview with the managing director of the Iran Air a number of years ago, and he was being asked, well, why had Iran Air not taken advantage of the offer by President Bush to allow the sale of aircraft spare parts to Iran? And he said, OFAC paperwork is way too complicated. It's much easier to buy in the black market.
So we have a question from Twitter, which I'm going to take, and then we'll take the woman in the second to last row there if you want to give her the microphone. So the Twitter question is, how might our decision to leave the JCPOA affect our relationship with Turkey and Qatar? I'll say something about Turkey if somebody has a thought on Qatar. Look, I think my impression of the Turks' view of our relations with Iran is, the Turks have an extensive trading relationship with Iran, which is not surprising given that they share a land border. It's an easy place for Turkey to get energy, for example, in terms of the logistics and the price. They also, though, maybe slightly in contrast, would like to see the United States take more action to counter Iran in the region, like many of our other regional allies, especially, I think, for the Turks in Syria, where we have not always found ourselves, let's say, strategically aligned with the Turks recently. So it's a bit of a mixed bag in that sense. If this leads to the United States getting more serious, for example, about rolling back Iranian influence in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, that might be welcome by the Turks, depending on what form that actually takes. However, if we're asking the Turks to curtail their trade with Iran, especially in oil, that will give rise to some tensions and difficulty. So there's two sides, in a sense, to the Turkey part of the equation, as far as I see it. Anyone want to comment on the Qataris and how this might impact?
After the dispute between Qatar and the UAE and the Saudis, there was a lot of reporting about how Qatari-Iran trade had dramatically increased, and it's true. It doubled. It went from being 1% of Qatar's imports to being 2% of Qatar's imports. So it doubled. But Qatar does not have a long history of relationships with Iran. It doesn't have the large presence of an Iranian community that you see in Dubai or much less Bahrain. And it doesn't have the depth of a financial system or financial sector that you see in Dubai or even Bahrain. So I think the potential is quite limited.
Okay, next question. Yes, I think, have we given her the mic? No, there we go.
Thank you so much. My name is Creighton Cameron. I'm with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. My question is related to kind of companies who may still do business in Iran. So, obviously companies are risk adverse. They don't want to run afoul of U.S. Secondary sanctions. But, if there are companies who are found to not be in compliance, like looking at the flip side of that with the current reimposition, do you have a sense of the U.S.'s willingness to put sanctions, for example, on a large European firm that maybe has a presence in the U.S., or kind of what is your sense of that?
I think that's an excellent question. I think that that's one of the major political and policy decisions the administration has to make is how vigorously will they implement these sanctions.
By the way, let me just note that there are some still substantial U.S. sales that go on to Iran. I mean, there are some years when wheat harvest is bad in Iran, and then Cargill has sold more than $100 million worth of wheat to Iran. And that's perfectly legal, and they have found ways to receive payment for it. So in spite of all the barriers that we were discussing, for things which are clearly OFAC licensed, it has been impossible to engage in very large, I says $100 million deals.
I mean, just further on this question, certainly the administration's initial comment suggests that they're trying to convey the message that they are willing to impose tough sanctions on these multinational firms. Secretary Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, in some of his initial comments said the U.S. was perfectly willing to accept tensions with allies, tensions with foreign firms, and so forth to get these sanctions implemented. And again, they pointed to the North Korea example where I think quite legitimately this administration was more aggressive than past administrations in getting those sanctions implemented. So certainly that's the message that's being sent, although I agree with Kate that really we'll see is the answer, to paraphrase President Trump.
And I would just add that getting anyone to, in the sanction context, getting someone to stop the activity actually doing the sanction is not the only option. You might not see that. As Mike said, the sanctions diplomacy is a very important part of it. So even if the U.S. government has information that someone is violating the sanctions, slapping them with a secondary sanction would not necessarily be the first order of business. So this is where it's going to be important to be engaging both with government counterparts and with the private sector.
Yes, sir. Just wait 1 second for the mic and identify yourself.
Milton Honig. Do the 90 or 100-day periods that you mentioned prior to the complete leaving the JCPOA, whatever, do they offer a possibility for further attempts at diplomacy and negotiations led by, say, Macron and the E3 to try to change things somewhat from where they are now?
Sure, possibly. So the question was, these 90 to 180-day wind-down periods for sanctions, do they offer a diplomatic window perhaps to avert the decision to bring back the sanctions? Yes. I mean, in theory. I think the real question will be, what is the U.S. government open to that sort of thing? So if the E3 approached Washington with an initiative, perhaps a stronger statement on sunset provisions, which was apparently the sticking point in the U.S. E3 discussions the first time around, would the president be willing to consider deferring the decision and taking a different route? We don't know the answer to that. My guess is the Europeans do not know the answer to that. If Iran came forward and said they were willing to negotiate, they were willing to sit down and so forth, would we be willing to consider that? Again, it's hard to say. I'm skeptical that latter scenario would actually happen. I think that getting Iran back to the table is a distant prospect at this stage. But it's certainly a possibility with the Europeans. It's certainly a possibility with other allies. But again, what we don't know is the U.S. openness to that.
I think Mike's being very optimistic because when the president withdrew, right, that kind of says we're out of here. It's not like he said, well, I'm not going to have a sanctions waiver any longer, which is what I think many of us anticipated he would do. Because you could link the sanctions waiver to saying that, well, the Iranian actions that led me to do this, or we want to see some perfections, but he just withdrew, and he said the fundamental structure of the deal is no good. That's a tough one to persuade this president to climb back on. Now, I understand this president's very good at proclaiming success in situations where not everybody would see a success. So maybe he could, but I just think that's a big step down.
I think in a sense, I don't disagree with Patrick about that. I think in a sense, though, you wouldn't necessarily have to be clawing back the decision. The question is, if you felt that there was an agreement which laid the foundation for whatever it was you were trying to do, could you issue certain exemptions and so forth without actually reversing the decision you had made? Because again, bear in mind that the president was, I think, pretty clear, and then subsequently U.S. officials were pretty clear that their aim is to have a bigger deal. Right, so that's what they're striving for, and so what we don't know is how do they see the path from here to there. Surely there's going to be some diplomacy involved, but we just don't know what the plan is. More questions.
We solved it all.
Well, I don't have any more questions from Twitter either. So if there's no more questions, let me just thank my colleagues, our fellow panelists here, and thank everyone who came to join us here in person and on live stream. Thanks so much.